I bought the ticket on a Tuesday afternoon in March, sitting alone in my kitchen with the radiator clanking the way it always clanked in that house. And I want to tell you that it felt like a dramatic decision, the kind of decision people imagine when they hear a story like mine. But the truth is that it felt almost administrative, quiet, final, the way you feel when you have finally finished a long calculation and arrived, without any particular drama, at the only answer the numbers actually support. One way. Cincinnati to Lisbon. I had never been to Portugal. I chose it, if I am honest, almost at random, from a list of cheap winter fares, the way you sometimes make the most important decisions of your life, from a list that was never designed to hold anything that significant. I blocked my daughter's number that same afternoon, then my son's, then the number for the family group text that had, for 3 years, become a place where I existed, mostly as a name, in a thread that other people used to coordinate things I was not actually invited to. Holiday plans discussed in detail before I was informed of the final arrangement. Birthday celebrations, where my attendance was assumed rather than requested. The specific quiet erasure that happens to a person inside a family that has decided, without ever saying so directly, that he has become optional. 11 months later, my daughter found me in a magazine. I want to tell you the whole story from the beginning, because I think people who hear the short version assume I am someone bitter, someone who ran away from his family out of spite or self-pity, and I do not think that is an accurate description of what happened, even though I understand why it might look that way from the outside. I think what actually happened is something closer to a man finally, after 3 years of waiting to be noticed, deciding to stop waiting. My name is Edward Calloway. I am 62 years old. I spent 33 years as a structural engineer in Cincinnati, Ohio, much of it working on bridge inspection and rehabilitation for a private consulting firm that contracted with the state. The kind of work that requires you to look very closely at things other people drive over every day without a second thought, checking for the small signs of stress that, left unaddressed, eventually become catastrophic failures. I retired 5 years ago, at 57, with a solid pension and the specific restlessness of a man who has spent his entire career looking for cracks before they become disasters and suddenly has nothing professional left to inspect. My wife Marion died 7 years ago. Breast cancer, 2 years from diagnosis to the end, and I am not going to spend a great deal of time on the details of that loss in this telling, except to say that Marion was the architecture that held our family together in a way I did not fully appreciate until she was gone, and that everything I am about to describe, the slow drift, the 3 years of being quietly set aside, happened almost entirely after she died, in the structural vacuum that her absence left behind. I have 2 children. My daughter Rachel is 38, married, a marketing director in Columbus, with 2 children of her own, Sophie and Marcus, who are 9 and 6. My son David is 35, unmarried, works in finance in Chicago, the kind of demanding job that has, over the years, become both his primary identity and his primary excuse. I want to be careful and fair as I describe what happened over those 3 years, because I do not believe either of my children woke up one morning and decided to abandon their father. I do not think it was ever a decision in that sense. I think it was the way most family estrangements actually happen, an accumulation of small choices, each one individually defensible, that added up over time to something that none of us, I suspect, would have chosen if we had seen the whole shape of it laid out clearly from the beginning. Marion died in October, the first year after her death. Both Rachel and David were, by any reasonable measure, attentive and present. They called regularly. Rachel drove down from Columbus most weekends that first winter, often with the children, and we would sit in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I would eventually buy that one-way ticket, and talk about Marion, about the specific holes her absence had left in the household, the recipes only she had known by memory, the way she used to manage the holiday logistics that none of the rest of us had ever bothered to learn. David called every Sunday that first year, a standing call, the same time, the same length, almost ritualistic in its consistency, and I remember thinking during that first year that grief had brought my children closer to me, rather than further away, which is the opposite of what I think most people expect, and the opposite of what eventually happened. The drift began, as far as I can identify it looking back, sometime in the second year. Rachel's visits became less frequent, monthly instead of weekly, then bi-monthly. I want to be fair here and acknowledge that her life had legitimate demands accumulating during this period. Marcus started kindergarten. Her job took on additional responsibilities after a promotion, the kind of ordinary adult life that genuinely does make weekly 2-hour drives to see a widowed father less sustainable than they might have been in an earlier season. I understood this. I did not, at the time, feel particularly aggrieved by it. David's Sunday calls became less consistent around the same period, sometimes skipping a week, then sometimes 2, always with a reasonable explanation when he did call, a demanding project at work, a trip he'd forgotten to mention, the ordinary friction of a busy professional life that I, having worked demanding hours myself for over 3 decades, was not inclined to judge harshly. What I want you to understand is that none of these individual changes on their own struck me as alarming. Children grow up, their lives fill with their own demands, and a parent who expects the same intensity of attention indefinitely after the early grief period has passed is, I think, asking for something that is not entirely reasonable. I told myself this repeatedly across the second year as the visits and calls continued to thin. The third year is where the story changes shape, because the third year is when I started to notice that the thinning was not simply a return to a normal, sustainable baseline of contact. It was something else. It was the specific experience of becoming, within my own family, an afterthought. I want to give you some specific examples because I think specifics matter more than general descriptions of feeling neglected, and because the specifics are what eventually became impossible for me to continue explaining away. In March of the third year, Rachel and her family went to Florida for spring break. I found out about this trip not from Rachel directly, but from a photograph she posted publicly, one I happened to see because a mutual family friend had commented on it 3 days into the trip. When I texted her gently, asking how the vacation was going, she replied that it had been a last-minute decision and that she'd meant to tell me, but things had gotten busy. I want to be honest that on its own, this is a forgivable oversight. It was the accumulation of moments like this, each individually forgivable, that eventually became the actual problem. In June of that year, David came through Cincinnati for a work conference, stayed 2 nights at a hotel less than 4 miles from my house, and did not tell me he was in town until after he had already left, mentioning it in an offhand way during a call the following week. "Oh, I was actually in Cincinnati last week for that conference. Things were just too packed to get away." In September, my birthday, my 60th, passed with a phone call from each of my children, both calls under 10 minutes, both calls that I could tell from the specific quality of distraction in their voices were being made from somewhere else, in the middle of something else, fulfilling an obligation rather than actually marking an occasion. There had been a small gathering, I learned much later, that Rachel had organized for her own milestone birthday a few months earlier with extended family and friends, an event I had not been invited to because, she explained, when I eventually asked, she had assumed I wouldn't want to make the drive. I want to tell you about Thanksgiving of that third year because I think it is the single incident that, more than any other, crystallized for me exactly what had happened to my place in this family. Rachel hosted Thanksgiving that year in Columbus, and I drove up, as I had every year since Marion died, assuming, because nobody had told me otherwise, that I was expected the way I had always been expected. When I arrived, I discovered that the guest list had expanded considerably beyond our immediate family. Rachel's husband's parents, several of their friends from the neighborhood, a configuration of people that made the gathering feel less like a family dinner and more like a party at which I happened to be present. I was seated at the dinner table at the far end near the children's section, and I want to be honest that I do not think this was a deliberate slight in the sense of an intentional insult. I think it was simply the result of a seating chart assembled by someone who was managing 22 guests and had not given any particular thought to where the widowed father should sit, because the widowed father had by that point become simply one more name on a list to be accommodated rather than a person whose presence required any special consideration. I sat at that table, near the children, while the adult conversation happened at the other end, and I remember looking down the length of that table at my daughter, laughing at something her father-in-law had said, fully present and engaged in a conversation that did not include me, and feeling, for the first time with real clarity, that I had become a guest in my own family life rather than a central figure in it. I drove home that night, 2 hours in the dark, and I did not say anything to Rachel about how the evening had felt. I want to explain why, because I think the reasons matter to understanding the rest of this story. I did not say anything because I did not yet trust my own perception. I told myself that I was an aging widower, prone to self-pity, perhaps reading too much significance into ordinary logistical accidents, the kind of seating chart oversight that happens at every large family gathering and means nothing about how anyone actually feels. It was Marion, in a sense, who eventually convinced me otherwise, though she had been gone for years by that point. I kept, in the year after her death, a habit she and I had shared for most of our marriage of talking things through out loud in the kitchen, even when she was no longer there to answer. I would stand at the counter in the evening sometimes and say things out loud that I was trying to work out. The way you talk to a person whose judgment you trusted so completely that simply imagining their response helps clarify your own thinking. Standing in that kitchen the week after that Thanksgiving, I said out loud, "Marion, am I imagining this?" And in the silence that followed, I heard, with the specific clarity that comes sometimes in grief, when you finally allow yourself to hear what you already know? The answer she would have given me, because I had heard her give versions of this answer to other people for decades about other situations entirely. She would have said, "Edward, you are not imagining the pattern. You are simply finally willing to look at it. I spent most of that fourth year, the year between that Thanksgiving and the ticket I eventually bought, watching the pattern continue and trying various small interventions. The kind of interventions that I think most people in my position attempt before they arrive at something as drastic as what I eventually did. I called Rachel directly and told her carefully, without accusation, that I had been feeling somewhat disconnected from the family and wondered if we might find a more regular rhythm of contact. She was apologetic, genuinely so, I believe, and for about 6 weeks the calls and visits increased again, before gradually settling back into the same thinned pattern that had become the actual baseline. I tried the same conversation with David, with a similar result. A brief improvement followed by a return to the previous distance. I want to be honest that I considered during this period whether the problem was actually mine, whether I had become, in the years since Marion's death, a less interesting or less engaged person to be around, someone whose company had simply stopped being something my children actively wanted, as opposed to something they tolerated out of obligation. I examined this possibility seriously because I think it is important, before concluding that other people have failed you, to honestly examine whether you have failed them first. I did not find in that examination evidence that I had become particularly difficult or withdrawn. I had continued seeing friends, continued some volunteer work inspecting structures for a local historical preservation society, continued the ordinary texture of an engaged retired life. I did not believe, after honest reflection, that the distance was primarily about something I had done. The final incident, the one that actually produced the ticket, happened in February of the following year, almost exactly 3 years after Marion's death. I had a minor health scare, a chest pain that turned out, after a frightening day in the emergency room, to be a gallbladder issue rather than the cardiac event the initial symptoms had suggested. I called Rachel from the hospital while waiting for test results in a moment of genuine fear, the kind of fear where you want, more than almost anything else, simply to hear a voice that loves you. She did not answer. I left a message. She called back 4 hours later, after the crisis had already resolved itself into the much less dramatic gallbladder diagnosis, apologetic that she had been in back-to-back meetings and hadn't seen my message until her lunch break, 4 hours after I had called her, frightened, from an emergency room. I called David later that same week to tell him about the whole episode, and he listened, said the appropriate things, and then mentioned in the same conversation that he was thinking about not making it down for Easter that year because he had a ski trip planned with friends that he'd been looking forward to for months. I sat in my kitchen the week after that with the radiator clanking, and I thought about 3 years of accumulated small absences, and I thought about a seating chart at the far end of a Thanksgiving table. And I thought about 4 hours in an emergency room waiting for a callback that arrived only after there was no longer anything frightening left to discuss. And I thought, with a clarity that felt less like anger than like simple administrative finality, that I had spent 3 years waiting to matter to my children in the way I once had, and that the waiting itself had become its own kind of harm, a thing I was doing to myself by continuing to extend patience toward a situation that showed no signs of resolving on its own. I want to explain the decision itself because I think it is the part of this story people find hardest to understand. The decision not simply to address the problem directly through some final difficult conversation, but to disappear entirely, to block contact, and leave the country without explanation. I had tried the direct conversation more than once across that 4th year and watched it produce brief improvement followed by relapse. I had come to believe, by that February, that the actual problem was not a misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication. The actual problem was that I had become, within my children's busy adult lives, a fixture whose presence was assumed rather than valued, the way you assume a load-bearing wall will simply continue holding weight without requiring any attention until the day it doesn't. I thought, and I want to be honest, that this thought arrived with more sadness than malice, that perhaps the only way to actually find out whether I mattered to my children in the deep sense rather than the assumed sense was to remove myself entirely and see what happened in the silence, not as a test designed to punish them, though I understand why it might look that way from the outside, more as an honest, if drastic, experiment, the kind of experiment an engineer runs when he genuinely does not know whether a structure will hold under a particular kind of stress. And the only way to find out is to actually apply the stress and observe the result. I sold the house within 2 months, the same house Marion and I had lived in for 26 years. The house where Rachel and David had grown up. I want to tell you that this was not an impulsive decision either. I had been quietly preparing it, almost unconsciously, for longer than I initially admitted to myself, having had a realtor friend give me an informal valuation almost a year earlier, under the pretense of simply being curious about the market. I liquidated most of my other assets into a form that would be accessible from abroad, consulted briefly with an attorney about the legal mechanics of an extended international stay, and told almost no one what I was actually planning, except my closest friend, a man named Harold Brennan, who had been my colleague for over 20 years before we both retired, and who, when I told him what I intended to do, listened without judgment and said only, "Edward, I think you have earned the right to disappear for a while if that's what you need." I left in March. I blocked Rachel's number, David's number, the family group text. On the same afternoon, I bought the ticket, not in a moment of dramatic fury, but with the same quiet, administrative finality with which I had bought the ticket itself. The sense of a man closing out a long calculation and recording the result. I want to tell you about the 11 months in Portugal, because I think people imagine when they hear this kind of story that the runaway parent spends the entire period in some state of bitter self-imposed exile, nursing a grudge, and that is not in any accurate sense what those 11 months were like for me. I rented a small apartment in a hill town outside Lisbon, in a region called the Sintra Hills, a place I had chosen almost at random from a list of available rentals, and that turned out to be one of the most beautiful places I have ever lived. Terraced gardens and old stone walls, and a quality of light in the late afternoon that I found myself genuinely, simply happy to wake up to every morning, in a way I had not expected and had not, frankly, felt much of in the years since Marion died. I spent those 11 months doing almost nothing that resembled my previous life. I took long walks. I learned, slowly and badly, enough Portuguese to manage a market and a conversation with my elderly downstairs neighbor, a widow named Fatima, who had lived in that building for 40 years and who, in the particular way that elderly women in small towns sometimes adopt a lonely foreigner, began leaving small dishes of food outside my door within the first month, a kindness I had not expected and that moved me more than I can adequately describe. I wrote, during those months, more than I had written in decades, not professionally, simply for myself, working through on paper the entire shape of what had happened over those 3 years, trying to understand it honestly, rather than simply feel wounded by it. I want to say clearly that the writing helped me arrive at a more generous understanding of my children than the bitterness I had carried out of that kitchen in March. I came to believe, through that writing, that what had happened to me was not a deliberate cruelty, but something closer to a structural failure in the family itself, a load that had never been properly redistributed after Marion died. The specific work of remembering and prioritizing an aging parent that she had always quietly performed and that nobody had consciously stepped into doing after she was gone, including, I had to admit honestly, me, who had never once said clearly, in those 3 years, here is what I actually need from you because I had been raised, the way many men of my generation were raised, to believe that needing things from your adult children was itself a kind of failure. I do not want to suggest that the 11 months were entirely peaceful reflection. There were difficult weeks, particularly around what would have been Marion's birthday in the 6th month, when the isolation I had chosen felt less like freedom and more like a second loss layered onto the first. And I spent several days during that period genuinely uncertain whether I had made a terrible mistake, whether disappearing from my children's lives, however neglectful those lives had become toward me, was simply trading one kind of pain for a different, more permanent kind. What kept me from reversing course during those difficult weeks was, oddly, the writing itself. Reading back over the specific catalog of incidents I had documented, the Thanksgiving seating chart, the 4 hours in the emergency room, the conference visit I learned about only after the fact, I found that the clarity of the pattern laid out in my own handwriting reasserted itself every time the loneliness made me want to unblock a number and call. Harold and I spoke regularly during those months, the one person who knew where I was and how to reach me, and I want to tell you about a conversation we had around month 9, because it matters to understanding what eventually happened. He asked me, during one of our calls, whether I intended to stay disappeared indefinitely or whether there was some end point I was working toward. I told him I did not entirely know. I told him that what I actually wanted, more than punishment or even reconciliation in the abstract, was simply to find out whether my absence would produce in my children the same quality of genuine searching and worry that their absence, over 3 years, had produced in me. I wanted to know, I told him, whether I actually mattered to them in the way a person matters when their disappearance becomes something you cannot simply absorb into a busy schedule. Harold told me during that same call that he had run into Rachel at a conference 6 weeks earlier, an industry event neither of them had expected the other to attend, and that she had asked him, with what he described as genuine and growing alarm, whether he had heard from me, because nobody in the family had been able to reach me in months. He told me he had said only that he believed I was fine and traveling, without revealing my specific location, honoring the confidence I had asked him to keep, but that the alarm in Rachel's voice, he said, had been real, not performative. The alarm of a daughter who had finally, fully understood that her father was actually gone, not simply quiet for a stretch, but genuinely, completely unreachable. I want to tell you now about how Rachel actually found me, because the magazine detail in this story's title is true, and I think the specifics of how it happened matter. I had, during those 11 months, taken up photography seriously for the first time in my life, something Marion had always encouraged me toward, and that I had never made time for during my working years. I photographed the hill town, the terraced gardens, Fatima and her small kindnesses, the specific quality of central light that had captivated me from the first week. I posted some of this work under a username that bore no resemblance to my actual name on a photography community website, more for the modest pleasure of sharing the images than for any ambition beyond that. A small regional travel magazine, the kind that exists in print and online and covers lesser-known destinations for an audience interested in slow, deliberate travel rather than typical tourist itineraries, found my photographs through that community site and reached out, asking permission to feature a selection of them, along with a short interview in a piece about expatriate life in the Central Hills. I agreed, somewhat reluctantly, because the editor was kind and the piece seemed genuinely respectful of the place rather than exploitative, and because, I will admit honestly, some part of me, 11 months into a deliberate disappearance, still wanted to be seen by someone, even anonymously, even at a careful distance. The piece ran in May, 11 months after I had left Cincinnati, with my photographs and a short profile that used only my first name, Edward, and described me accurately enough as a retired American engineer who had settled in the area after the death of his wife. Rachel found it, she told me much later, almost by accident, scrolling through a travel website during a slow afternoon at work, drawn initially simply by the photographs themselves, the terraced gardens in the particular light, before something in the brief biographical description, retired American engineer, widower, made her stop scrolling and look more carefully at the images themselves. She recognized, she told me, the angle of a particular stone wall in one photograph as the exact wall from a vacation Marion and I had taken to Portugal decades earlier, before either of our children were born. A single trip we had described to them many times over the years, the trip where Marion had first fallen in love with the idea of the Central Hills, a place she had always said she wanted to return to and never had. Rachel told me, when we eventually spoke again, that she had sat at her desk staring at that photograph for almost 20 minutes, certain and uncertain at the same time, before finally enlarging the small headshot included with the interview, a photograph the magazine had taken of me sitting on my small terrace, and recognizing, with what she described as a physical jolt, her own father's face, 11 months older and considerably more relaxed than the face she remembered from that last Thanksgiving. I want to tell you about the message she eventually sent through the magazine's contact form, because the editor forwarded it to me without my having given permission for my contact information to be shared. A small ethical lapse I forgave entirely once I understood the circumstances. The message said simply, "Dad, it's Rachel. I found you in a magazine. I have been trying to reach you for almost a year. I don't know what happened or why you left the way you did, but I need you to know that not knowing where you were or whether you were safe has been the most frightening thing I have ever experienced. And I am asking you, please, however angry you might be at us, to let me know that you are alive. I sat with that message for 3 days before I responded, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely needed that time to decide what kind of conversation I actually wanted to have. The same deliberateness with which I had approached every other decision across those 11 months. I responded on the 4th day. I told her I was alive and well, and that I had left deliberately, not as an accident or a crisis, but as a considered response to 3 years of feeling like an afterthought in my own family's life. I told her about the Thanksgiving seating chart, the emergency room, the conference visit she had not mentioned until after the fact, not as accusations exactly, but as the specific evidence I had been quietly accumulating, the catalog that had eventually convinced me that something needed to change more dramatically than another gentle conversation could produce. She called me after reading that message, and we talked for almost 3 hours, the longest single conversation Rachel and I had had in at least 5 years. And I want to tell you that it was not an easy conversation. There was anger in it, hers at my methods, mine at the pattern that had preceded them. But underneath the anger, both of us arrived, gradually, at something more honest than either of us had managed in years, a genuine accounting of what had actually happened in our family after Marion died, the load that had gone unredistributed, the assumption on everyone's part, including mine, that things would simply continue working the way they always had without anyone needing to actively maintain them. She told me, near the end of that call, that the 11 months of silence had done something to her that 3 years of my gentle, repeated attempts to address the distance directly had never managed to do. It had forced her, she said, to actually sit with the possibility of losing me entirely, rather than simply assuming, the way she had been assuming for years, that I would always be there, patient and available, regardless of how much active attention she gave to maintaining the relationship. David called 2 days after Rachel did, having heard from her, and that conversation followed a similar shape, defensive at first, then gradually more honest, arriving eventually at an acknowledgment from him that he had let his relationship with me atrophy in exactly the way you let any relationship atrophy when you assume it requires no maintenance, simply because it has always been there. I returned to the United States 4 months after that magazine piece ran, not to Cincinnati, but to a smaller house I bought outside Columbus, close enough to Rachel that the kind of regular, easy contact that had defined our relationship before Marion died became logistically simple again, but with an explicit, repeated agreement between us, the kind of structural agreement I understand from 30 years of engineering work, that relationships, like bridges, require ongoing maintenance and inspection, not simply an assumption that they will continue holding weight indefinitely without anyone checking for the small signs of stress. I see Sophie and Marcus regularly now, in a way that feels intentional rather than assumed. David flies in more often than he used to, and we have an actual standing arrangement, not the loose, easily abandoned Sunday call ritual from years ago, but something both of us have committed to maintaining, even when, especially when, life gets busy enough that it would be easy to let it lapse. I do not want to oversell the resolution into something tidier than it actually is. There remains, between my children and me, a specific awareness of what happened. The fact that I was willing to disappear entirely for almost a year rather than continue extending patience toward a situation I had concluded was not improving. And I think that awareness has changed something permanently in how all three of us understand each other. A kind of seriousness underneath the restored warmth that did not exist before. I do not think either of my children will ever again assume, the way they once did, that my presence in their lives is simply a fixed, reliable backdrop that requires no active tending. I think about Fatima sometimes, my elderly neighbor in Sintra, who continued leaving small dishes of food outside my door for the entire 11 months, without ever once asking me why an American man was living alone in her building or what he might be running from. The specific, undemanding kindness of someone who simply decided, without being asked, that a lonely person nearby deserved attention. I think about the fact that a stranger gave me, instinctively and without effort, exactly the kind of unprompted, unrequested attentiveness that I had spent 3 years trying and failing to receive from my own children. And I think there is something important in that contrast, though I am still even now working out exactly what it means. I think mostly, though, about the photograph Rachel recognized, the stone wall from a trip her mother and I took decades before she was born, and the strange, almost impossible coincidence that the specific evidence which finally reached her, breaking through 11 months of silence, was an image connected to her mother, to the very person whose absence had set this entire chain of events into motion in the first place. I do not believe in fate in any grand cosmic sense, but I believe, now more than I once did, that some threads in a family continue running underneath the surface long after the person who wove them is gone, and that those threads sometimes surface again in unexpected places at exactly the moment they are most needed. I bought a one-way ticket on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting alone in a kitchen with a clanking radiator, because I had finally stopped waiting to be noticed and decided to find out definitively whether my absence would matter as much as my presence apparently no longer did. 11 months later, my daughter found me in a magazine, recognized a wall her mother had once stood in front of, and decided that she was not willing to lose me the way the silence had threatened to take me. That is the whole of it. That is what actually happened, and what I have learned from it, more than anything else, is that love within a family is not a fixed structure that simply continues holding weight indefinitely once it has been built. It requires the same ongoing attention that any bridge requires, the same willingness to notice small signs of stress before they become something catastrophic. And I think, finally, after 62 years, I understand that lesson not as an engineer applying it to steel and concrete, but as a father applying it at last to the people I love most.